The wire was thinner than a pencil lead, 17,000 feet of it, coiled inside a bobbin no bigger than a coffee can, and when the missile launched, that wire spooled out behind it at 400 feet per second, while a gunner tried to hold crosshairs steady on a target almost 2 miles away. One gust of wind in the wrong direction, one sharp banking turn from the helicopter, and the wire snapped. Connection gone. Missile stupid. 30 pounds of shaped charge corkscrewing into empty jungle. That was the TOW missile in 1972. The BGM-71, if you want the full designation, a weapon designed for ground vehicles, bolted onto the skid pylons of a UH-1B Huey that had no business carrying anti-tank ordnance. The Huey was a transport bird, a slick. The thing that dropped grunts into landing zones and hauled casualties out. Now somebody at the Pentagon had decided to hang a pair of missile launchers off its sides and send it hunting T-54s, 36 tons of Soviet-built main battle tank with 100 millimeters of cast steel armor on the turret front. The helicopter weighed about 9,500 pounds fully loaded. The tank weighed 4 times that. You don't need an engineering degree to see the mismatch. A lot of what happened next is fading out of living memory. The guys who flew these missions, who sat in the left seat wrestling with a guidance sight while rotor wash tried to shake the airframe apart. Most of them are in their 70s and 80s now. Some are gone already. The technical reports survive in archives, but the feel of the thing, the smell of JP-4 exhaust mixing with red Vietnamese dust at a forward operating base, that lives only in the men who were there. If these accounts matter to you, and they should, a like and subscribe keeps them circulating. Drop a comment if you've heard a veteran talk about this. Those first-hand details are worth more than anything I can pull from a declassified file. The missile itself was a simple thing, and every piece of that simplicity could fail on you. Tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided, that's what TOW stood for, and every word in that acronym represented a potential failure point. The gunner didn't fire and forget, he fired and concentrated. For the entire flight time of the missile, somewhere between 7 and 20 seconds depending on range, he had to keep a set of crosshairs pinned on the target while the guidance computer sent corrections down that impossibly thin wire. The helicopter had to hold relatively steady during the engagement. No evasive maneuvering, no hard turns. Just hover or slow cruise, while every North Vietnamese soldier, within earshot, tried to figure out where the sound was coming from. The engagement envelope topped out at 3,000 meters, almost 2 miles. At that distance, a T-54 looks like a dark smudge through the optical sight, barely distinguishable from the terrain around it. The crew's training for this mission back at Fort Huachuca had practiced against stationary hulks painted bright orange on flat desert ground. What waited for them in Vietnam was something else entirely. North Vietnam's generals had spent the better part of a decade watching American air power shred their infantry in the open. They drew the obvious conclusion, and the wrong lesson, from it. By early 1972, Hanoi had assembled the largest conventional invasion force Southeast Asia had seen since the Chinese crossed the Yalu River in 1950. 600 tanks. Somewhere north of 120,000 regular NVA troops organized into divisions, not guerrilla cells. This was not another Tet, no coordinated uprising, no suicide attacks on embassy walls. This was a Soviet-style armored offensive with artillery preparation, echeloned advances, and a logistics tail stretching back to Hanoi. The T-54s rolling south on Route 1 had been shipped from factories in the Ural Mountains, crewed by men trained at armor schools modeled on Red Army doctrine. The plan called for 3 simultaneous thrusts across the DMZ, through the Central Highlands, and into Binh Long Province north of Saigon. Crack the ARVN in 3 places at once, and the whole thing collapses before Washington can escalate. That was the bet. According to captured planning documents, and the CIA's own post-offensive analysis from late '72, Hanoi's senior leadership believed the timing was close to perfect. American ground forces had drawn down to fewer than 70,000 advisors and support personnel. Nixon was tangled in an election year. The anti-war movement had Congress by the throat. General Vo Nguyen Giap, or more precisely his planning staff under Senior General Van Tien Dung, calculated that ARVN forces would fold without American infantry stiffening the line. The tanks were the key, not because North Vietnamese commanders had suddenly become believers in mobile warfare. Most of them had spent their careers fighting light infantry campaigns in triple canopy jungle. The tanks were the key because they were a psychological weapon. Our RVN soldiers had almost no experience facing armor. The few M72 LAW rockets in South Vietnamese inventory could theoretically penetrate a T-54's hull. But theory and a 19-year-old conscript shaking behind a rice paddy dike have never had much to do with each other. The shock effect of tanks was considered decisive, reads one translated NVA after action assessment. Their word, decisive. And for the first 72 hours of the Easter Offensive, launched March 30th, 1972, it looked like they were right. ARVN positions along the DMZ crumbled. Fire bases fell one after another. The smell of burning diesel and cordite hung in river valleys as columns of T-54s pushed through defensive lines that existed mostly on paper. What Hanoi's planners had not accounted for was a weapon system that didn't exist in any intelligence file they possessed. We expected to be in An Loc by the second day. That line comes from a captured NVA regimental officer interrogated sometime in May of '72, and there's no reason to doubt him. Every piece of arithmetic said he was right. An Loc was a provincial capital in Binh Long Province, about 60 miles north of Saigon on Route 13. Calling it a city is generous. Maybe 15,000 civilians before the offensive, a handful of administrative buildings, a small airstrip. The place mattered because of what it sat on, the most direct road corridor into the capital from the Cambodian border. Take An Loc, and you've got a straight shot south. Hanoi designated it the objective for the third prong of the Easter Offensive, assigning the 5th 5C Division and the 9th NVA Division to the task, reinforced by elements of the 7th NVA Division swinging in from the west. Combined strength somewhere around 35,000 troops with armored support. Defending the town was the 5th ARVN Division under Brigadier General Le Van Hung. On paper, his division was already under strength before the fighting started, maybe 6,000 effective troops, possibly fewer. The records from ARVN personnel offices in this period are a mess, and I've seen estimates ranging from 5,000 to 8,000 depending on which source you trust. What nobody disputes is the ratio. The NVA had somewhere between a 4-to-1 and 6-to-1 advantage in manpower, plus armor that the defenders essentially could not stop. The British had run into a similar problem at Arnhem in 1944, a lightly armed airborne force holding a town against armored columns that shouldn't have been there. That comparison only goes so far, but the underlying math is the same. Light infantry without anti-armor capability does not hold ground against tanks in open terrain. It just doesn't. The NVA plan was not complicated. When you outnumber the enemy 5-to-1 and have tanks, you don't need it to be. Fix the garrison with infantry pressure from multiple directions. Push T-54s and PT-76 light tanks directly into the town along Route 13 from the north. The PT-76 weighed only about 14 tons and was technically a reconnaissance vehicle. But against defenders armed with small arms and a scattering of M72 LAWs, it was more than sufficient. Crack the perimeter, roll armor into the streets, and the psychological collapse that had worked at Dong Ha and Loc Ninh would work here too. Loc Ninh, another district capital 20 miles further north, had fallen on April 7th after barely 2 days of fighting. The garrison there broke when the tanks appeared. General Hung knew what was coming. A RVN intelligence had been tracking the NVA buildup for weeks, and the fall of Loc Ninh made the next target obvious. He pulled his forces into a tight defensive perimeter roughly 1.5 kilometers across and ordered civilians into shelters. He also requested air support that nobody was sure would arrive in time. The first NVA tanks were spotted north of the city on April 12th. The United States Army had not fought a defensive battle against massed armor since the Chinese Spring Offensive of 1951. 21 years. An entire generation of officers had come up through a system that assumed American forces would always have air superiority, artillery dominance, and their own armor on hand to meet enemy tanks. The doctrine manuals were written for the Fulda Gap, for NATO forces stopping a Soviet armored thrust across the North German plain with Patton tanks, Cobra gunships, and tactical nuclear weapons if it came to that. Nobody had written the manual for a 6,000-man South Vietnamese garrison with no tanks, limited artillery, and a supply line that ran through 60 miles of contested jungle. The M-72 law was the standard infantry anti-armor weapon of the period. A disposable, shoulder-fired rocket weighing about 5.5 pounds. Maximum effective range against a moving target, roughly 200 meters. The warhead could penetrate up to 300 millimeters of rolled homogeneous steel under ideal conditions, which meant it could theoretically kill a T-54 from the side or rear. But ideal conditions don't exist when a 40-ton vehicle is grinding toward your foxhole at 25 kilometers per hour, with a coaxial machine gun hosing your position. The LAW demanded that a soldier stand up, expose himself, hold steady, and fire at a range where the tank crew could see the whites of his eyes. Miss rates in combat were catastrophic. According to one advisory team report from the An Loc fighting, ARVN troops fired over 100 LAWs during the first major armored assault on April 13th. Confirmed kills from LAW fire alone. The report lists 2, maybe 3. The language is ambiguous. So what was supposed to fill that gap? Air power could do it, and eventually did. Cobra gunships firing TOW missiles and Air Force fast movers dropping precision ordnance accounted for the bulk of NVA armor losses throughout the Easter offensive. But air power requires coordination, communication, weather, and time. During the initial assaults on An Loc, cloud cover sat below 1,000 feet for days. Tactical air was sporadic. The NVA had also brought along SA-7 Grail shoulder-fired surface-to-air missiles in significant numbers for the first time, a detail that caught American aviation planners off guard. The Grail's infrared seeker could track a helicopter's engine exhaust out to about 3.5 kilometers. A Huey flying slow enough to guide a TOW missile was, from the SA-7 operator's perspective, barely moving at all. The deeper problem was institutional. ARVN had been built as a counterinsurgency force. American advisors had spent years training South Vietnamese units to fight guerrillas, small unit patrols, village defense, cordon and search operations. The idea that Hanoi would throw 600 tanks across the border in a conventional invasion struck many planners as unlikely right up until it happened. One MACV assessment from February of '72 rated the probability of a multi-division armored offensive as moderate. Moderate. A month before the largest ground attack since the Korean War. The smell of hydraulic fluid hung sharp and chemical inside the cramped cockpits of the TOW-equipped Hueys staging at Bien Hoa Air Base in early April. The crews assigned to what the Army called the 1st Combat Aerial TOW team knew the weapon was experimental. The entire unit consisted of just 2 UH-1B helicopters, each carrying a single XM-26 weapons subsystem with 2 launch tubes. 4 missiles ready at any given time, 4 missiles against an armored division. Redstone Arsenal, Alabama, 1962. The Army's missile engineers had a problem they couldn't stop thinking about. Soviet tank production was running at roughly 4,000 vehicles per year, and NATO's anti-armor doctrine still relied on manned aircraft and other tanks to stop them. If the Fulda Gap ever opened up for real, if columns of T-55s and T-62s came pouring through the Hessian countryside, there simply would not be enough Pattons and Sheridans to meet them hull to hull. The math didn't work. It hadn't worked since the late 50s, and every year the Soviets built more tanks. The arithmetic got worse. The requirement that eventually produced the TOW came out of this anxiety. The Army wanted a heavy anti-tank weapon that infantry could carry, that could kill any Soviet tank in existence at ranges beyond a kilometer, and that could be adapted for vehicle or helicopter mounting. The contract went to Hughes Aircraft in 1963. Development designation, BGM-71. The acronym stood for tube-launched, optically tracked, wire-guided. You can tell an engineer named it. On paper, the operating principle sounds almost too straightforward. A gunner looked through a magnified optical sight, placed crosshairs on a target, and pulled the trigger. The missile launched from its tube, and an infrared tracker on the launcher automatically detected a beacon on the missile's tail. A guidance computer compared where the missile was to where the crosshairs were pointed and sent correction commands down two hair-thin wires that spooled out behind the missile in flight. The gunner's only job after launch was to keep the crosshairs on the target, hold steady for roughly 12 seconds at maximum range, and the missile would fly itself into whatever you were looking at. 12 seconds doesn't sound like much. Try counting to 12 while someone shoots at you. The warhead was a shaped charge, 5 inches in diameter, capable of penetrating over 430 millimeters of armor. That was enough to go through the front glacis of any tank in the Soviet inventory in 1972, not just the side or rear. The T-54's frontal armor measured roughly 203 millimeters at its thickest point. The TOW could punch through that twice over. Range was 3,700 meters, nearly 2 miles. For comparison, the M-72 law that ARVN troops were burning through by the crate outside An Loc had an effective combat range of maybe 150 meters against a moving target. The TOW could kill from 24 times that distance. None of that weight and range data was abstract for what was about to happen in Binh Long Province. The missile weighed about 42 pounds in its launch container. The ground-mounted system with tripod and sight weighed over 270 pounds broken down for transport. You weren't humping that through jungle. The helicopter variant solved the weight problem by bolting the launcher to a UH-1B airframe, but it created a different one. The helicopter had to fly slow and straight for the entire flight time of the missile. Any significant maneuvering would break the wire or throw the guidance off. A hovering Huey at 3,000 meters was survivable against small arms. Against an SA-7 crew that knew what they were doing, it was a calculated risk that the Army had never actually tested under fire. The entire program had been designed to stop Soviet armor in Central Europe. Testing had occurred at ranges in New Mexico and Alabama. Flat desert, clear skies, stationary target hulks painted in high visibility colors. The closest thing to a combat evaluation had been a series of demonstrations for NATO allies where Hughes engineers handpicked the conditions. Nobody at Redstone Arsenal or Hughes Aircraft had imagined the weapon's combat debut would involve 2 modified Hueys flying over triple canopy jungle in monsoon weather, guided by advisors on the ground who were themselves under artillery fire. The TOW had never killed anything that was trying to kill back. On the morning of April 19, 1972, somewhere along the tree line north of An Loc, it would. The XM-26 installation smelled like fresh epoxy and machine oil, because half of it had been hand-fitted in a maintenance bay at Fort Lewis, Washington, less than 2 months before it shipped to Vietnam. You could see the tool marks on the mounting brackets where technicians had filed aluminum to fit. This was not a production weapon system. It was a prototype bolted to a helicopter that had been designed to carry troops, not kill tanks. The UH-1B airframe dated to the early 60s. Bell Helicopter had built it as a utility transport, the iconic slick, the workhorse of the air assault concept that the Army had bet its future on. Gross weight around 9,500 pounds. Single Lycoming. T-53 turboshaft producing 1,100 horsepower. Cruise speed of roughly 100 knots. The airframe was tough and reliable, about as aerodynamic as a filing cabinet. Mounting a TOW launcher on it required removing the troop seats, installing the XM-26 subsystem on the left side of the fuselage, running new wiring harnesses to a gunner's sight in the left crew position, and adding a stabilization system that tried to keep the optical tracker steady while the rotor beat the airframe like a drum 60 times per second. 2 helicopters. That's what the Army sent. The first combat aerial TOW team consisted of the 2 modified UH-1Bs, their flight crews, a small maintenance detachment, and a handful of Hughes Aircraft technical representatives who had volunteered to deploy with the unit. I've tried to pin down the exact number of personnel. The after-action reports reference approximately 20 total, but one account from a maintenance NCO lists 17 names. The discrepancy probably doesn't matter, but it bugs me. Either way, this was a tiny element, smaller than a platoon, being asked to validate a weapons concept that the Army had spent 9 years and hundreds of millions of dollars developing. The flight crews had trained at Fort Huachuca, Arizona, where the desert air was dry and stable, and the test targets were old tank hulks arranged at known distances on flat ground. The gunner could take his time acquiring the target through the 13-power optical sight, settle the crosshairs, and fire. Wire breakage rates during testing ran around 4%. Miss rates were low. The after-action review from the Huachuca qualification trials describes the system's accuracy as exceptional under controlled conditions. That qualifier, under controlled conditions, does a lot of heavy lifting. An Loc was not controlled conditions. The engagement profile that the TOW demanded from a helicopter was borderline suicidal by any conventional aviation standard. The pilot had to fly toward the target area, decelerate to a near hover or slow orbit at a range between 1,500 and 3,700 meters, then hold that position while the gunner acquired a target, fired, and guided the missile to impact. Flight time to a target at 3,000 meters was approximately 11 seconds. During those 11 seconds, the helicopter could not execute any evasive maneuver more aggressive than a gentle drift. The wire would snap. The missile would go stupid. The money shot would turn into an expensive firework. 1,500 meters was the near boundary of the engagement envelope. Anything closer and the missile couldn't complete its guidance corrections in time. Anything further than 3,700 and the wire ran out. So you had a band, roughly 2 kilometers deep, where the system worked. Inside that band, a Huey hanging in the air at 40 knots or less presented a target that any competent machine gunner could engage. The DSHK heavy machine gun that NVA units mounted on their armored vehicles had an effective range of about 1,500 meters against aircraft. The ZSU-57-2 self-propelled anti-aircraft gun could reach out past 4,000. Both were present around An Loc in significant numbers. And then there were the SA-7s. The crews knew the math. A Huey's exhaust plume was a bright infrared signature, and the SA-7 Grail needed about 5 seconds to lock on. The missile itself flew at roughly 500 meters per second. If an SA-7 operator acquired you at 2,000 meters, you had approximately 4 seconds between launch and impact. The only countermeasure available in April of '72 was a hard brake. Turn away from the missile to present a reduced heat signature and hope the seeker lost track. But a hard brake turn during a TOW engagement meant losing the shot. You could defend yourself or you could kill the tank. The system did not allow for both. The crews at Bien Hoa loaded missiles, checked wire bobbins, ran diagnostic tests on guidance electronics that had never operated in 95% humidity. Nobody had a manual for what they were about to do. The manual was going to be whatever happened next. Route 13, north of An Loc, pre-dawn hours of April 19th. The T-54s moved in column along the Laterite Road with their headlights off. Diesel engines audible for a kilometer in every direction. NVA armored doctrine was Soviet armored doctrine, learned at training facilities outside Odessa and adapted loosely for Indochina. Tanks advance in mass. Infantry follows in the gaps. Artillery suppresses the defensive positions ahead of the formation, and the armor punches through whatever remains. The playbook had worked at Loc Ninh a week earlier, where ARVN defenders broke and ran after the first tanks appeared on the perimeter. The NVA tank crews rolling south had reason to believe An Loc would go the same way. Their intelligence picture was incomplete in one specific and fatal respect. NVA battlefield assessments from the Loc Ninh fighting cataloged American and ARVN aviation assets in the area as transport helicopters, observation aircraft, fixed-wing tactical bombers, and the usual medevac traffic. The Huey was a known quantity, a troop carrier, a medevac platform, a resupply bird, occasionally a gunship when fitted with door guns or rocket pods. Annoying but not lethal to armor. The AH-1G Cobra was a more serious concern, but its standard armament of 2.75-inch rockets and minigun fire couldn't penetrate the T-54's turret or hull. NVA crews had trained against these threats. Button up, keep moving, let the ZSUs and SA-7 teams handle the helicopters. The tank's job was to reach the perimeter and start killing bunkers. What no NVA intelligence summary mentioned, because no NVA intelligence officer knew, was that a wire-guided missile capable of defeating their frontal armor from nearly 2 miles away had been mounted on those same Huey airframes. The weapon didn't appear in any Soviet threat briefing either. Moscow knew about the TOW program in general terms, the way defense ministries track each other's procurement budgets, but the helicopter-mounted variant hadn't been flagged as operationally deployed. Because officially, it wasn't. 2 prototype aircraft on a combat evaluation don't show up in order of battle assessments. The column commander, rank and name unknown, lost to whatever records Hanoi kept and hasn't released, would have been operating under standing orders to reach An Loc's northern perimeter before dawn, coordinate with infantry already probing the defensive wire, and exploit any breach. His tanks carried roughly 40 rounds of 100mm ammunition each, a mix of armor-piercing and high-explosive fragmentation. More than enough for a garrison with no armor of its own. The T-54's 100mm D-10 rifled gun could destroy any bunker the ARVN defenders had built. Against infantry in foxholes, a tank is a medieval siege engine with a machine gun. The column kept moving south. Somewhere behind them, rotor blades were already turning. 0847 local, April 19th, 1972. The lead Huey came in low over the tree line from the southeast, rotors chopping humid air that smelled like rain and burning rubber from the artillery strikes still falling on An Loc's northern perimeter. The pilot, whose name appears in the after-action report but whose family has asked that it not be publicized, a request I'll respect, brought the aircraft to a deceleration that pushed everyone forward against their harnesses, airspeed dropping through 60 knots, 40, 25. The Huey settled into a shallow orbit at roughly 3,000 meters from the road, nose slightly low, left side of the aircraft facing the target area. The gunner found the column almost immediately through the 13-power sight. T-54s on Route 13, moving south in file. The lead tank was partially obscured by vegetation, but the second vehicle sat in a gap between tree lines, exposed, broadside, still rolling forward at maybe 15 kilometers per hour. The gunner placed his crosshairs center mass on the turret. At 3,000 meters, the tank filled only a fraction of the sight picture, a dark rectangle trailing diesel exhaust against red laterite road. He squeezed the trigger. The launch motor fired with a sound the crew later described as a loud pop, followed by a sustained hiss, nothing like the roar of a rocket pod salvo. The missile cleared the tube, the sustainer motor ignited, and 17,000 feet of wire began unspooling from the bobbin at a rate that would empty it in just under 12 seconds. The infrared tracker locked onto the missile's tail beacon. Guidance commands started flowing down the wire. The gunner held the crosshairs on the turret and tried to ignore everything else. The airframe vibrating under him, the radio chatter from the ARVN advisors below. The rotor wash shaking the sight picture. The fact that every DSHK and SA-7 crew within 2 kilometers had just watched a Huey stop moving and hang in the sky like a paper lantern. The British had experimented with wire-guided missiles from helicopters in the mid-60s, firing the SS-11 from scout helicopters in test conditions. They never took it to combat, none of which mattered to the gunner holding his crosshairs steady over An Loc. 11 seconds, the missile covered 3,000 meters of air in 11 seconds, trailing wire so thin it was invisible past 50 feet. The shaped charge detonated against the T-54's turret. The jet of superplastic copper penetrated the armor at roughly 8,000 meters per second, a molten needle moving faster than any bullet ever made. The after-action report states the turret was visibly displaced. Ammunition inside the tank cooked off seconds later. The fireball rose above the tree canopy. The crew of that T-54 never fired a round. They likely never saw the helicopter. At 3,000 meters, a UH-1B in a shallow orbit against a cloudy sky is a speck. The missile itself makes no sound audible over a diesel engine until the last fraction of a second, and by then the shaped charge has already formed. The gunner released the trigger. The pilot held the orbit for 4 more seconds, watching the smoke, then broke right and dropped below the tree line to reload. Total time exposed, under 20 seconds. The wire, spent and weightless, drifted down through the canopy like fishing line. 1 missile and 1 tank separated by 3,000 meters of wire-thin air. The TOW worked. Bien Hoa Airfield, late afternoon, April 19th. The first Huey came back with empty launch tubes and a maintenance crew waiting to reload it. The second aircraft was already airborne, heading north toward the smoke columns still rising from Route 13. Between the 2 helicopters, working in alternating cycles that kept at least 1 aircraft over the battlefield at nearly all times, the 1st Combat Aerial TOW team would destroy 24 NVA armored vehicles during the initial engagement series around An Loc 24. I want to sit with that number for a moment and run the math, because the math tells you more than the narrative does. A T-54 medium tank weighed approximately 36 metric tons combat loaded, crew of 4, unit cost to the Soviet Union, who supplied them to Hanoi at subsidized rates, somewhere around 200,000 rubles in 1972 pricing, which converts very roughly to $220,000 at the official exchange rate. The unofficial rate would put it lower, but we'll use the higher figure because it's more interesting. 24 tanks at $220,000 each comes to $5 million, $280,000 in destroyed armor, 96 crew members killed or wounded, hundreds of tons of steel rendered into burning scrap along a single stretch of laterite road. The cost of the munitions that did this? A BGM-71 TOW missile ran approximately $6,800 per unit in 1972 procurement costs. 24 missiles assuming perfect efficiency, 1 shot, 1 kill, which the after-action reports suggest was close to accurate, though not quite perfect, across the full engagement series, would cost $163,200. Call it $170,000 with the misses factored in, since wire breakage and guidance failures ate a small percentage of shots. The exchange ratio works out to roughly $31 of armor destroyed for every dollar of missile expended. You don't need an economics degree to understand what that means for a country trying to sustain an armored offensive on a wartime budget subsidized by Moscow. The weight disparity is even more absurd. Each TOW missile weighed about 49 pounds at launch. The tank it killed weighed 36,000 kilograms. That's a destruction ratio of roughly 1,600 to 1 by mass. A weapon light enough for 2 men to carry was erasing vehicles that required an entire railroad flat car to transport. During the Yom Kippur War, 18 months later, the Israelis would discover a similar equation when Egyptian infantry armed with Soviet AT-3 Sagar missiles savaged their armor in the Sinai. The Sagar was older technology, manually guided by a joystick, slower, less accurate, but the principle was identical. A man with a suitcase-sized weapon could kill a tank worth 100 times its cost. The Israelis lost roughly 800 armored vehicles in 18 days and had to completely rethink their doctrine of unsupported armor charges. But that's a different war. What made An Loc distinct was the delivery platform. The Egyptian Sagar teams were infantry, dug into fixed positions along the canal. They could be flanked, suppressed, overrun. A helicopter carrying TOW could not be flanked because it wasn't on the ground. It appeared, fired, killed, and vanished below the tree line before the column could organize a coherent response. The engagement geometry was fundamentally unfair. The tank crew's world was horizontal. Threats came from the front, the flanks, occasionally the rear. The TOW Huey operated in a vertical dimension the T-54 had no effective answer for. The tank's main gun could not elevate high enough to engage a helicopter. The coaxial machine gun lacked the range. The only defense was dedicated anti-aircraft assets, and those had to be positioned correctly, manned, and alerted before the helicopter fired. According to the after-action report, NVA anti-aircraft response during the first day's engagements was sporadic and inaccurate. By the second day, it had improved. By the third day, the SA-7 teams had repositioned to cover the likely helicopter approach routes, and the DSHK gunners were firing at sound. The NVA were learning. They were adapting the way competent military organizations adapt, observing the threat, analyzing the pattern, repositioning assets, adjusting dispositions. The problem was that adaptation takes time, and tanks were burning faster than new countermeasures could reach the field. The two Hueys flew multiple sorties per day. Each sortie carried enough missiles for 2 to 4 engagements, depending on the load configuration. Turnaround time at Bien Hoa for rearming and refueling ran approximately 45 minutes according to the maintenance logs, though one entry notes a 17-minute turnaround when the crew chief skipped the post-flight inspection entirely. I suspect someone got yelled at for that later. 24 tanks, 2 helicopters, a weapon that had never been fired in anger 60 days earlier. A wire thinner than a pencil lead had just upended the economics of armored warfare. We didn't think we'd still be here in May. That's from an ARVN lieutenant colonel quoted in a Military Assistance Command Vietnam field report dated June 3, 1972. He'd been inside An Loc for 66 days by then. The report notes his weight at the time of interview as roughly 43 kilograms, 95 pounds. A grown man, a combat officer, reduced to the weight of a teenager by 2 months of siege rations and dysentery. An Loc held. The NVA launched 3 major armored assaults against the city between April and June. The first, which the TOW Hueys shattered on April 19th, was the strongest. Subsequent attacks came with fewer tanks, wider dispersal, more anti-aircraft preparation. The NVA adapted. They moved armor at night. They broke columns into individual vehicles separated by hundreds of meters. They pushed ZPU-4 batteries forward along the approach routes and positioned SA-7 teams in overlapping arcs designed to cover the helicopter orbits that American pilots had used during the first engagements. All of this was competent and professional, and ultimately insufficient. The TOW crews changed their approach headings and varied their altitudes. They came in from directions the anti-aircraft gunners weren't covering and fired from ranges the DSHK couldn't reach. 2 prototype helicopters with hand-filed mounting brackets kept finding ways to kill tanks. Inside the perimeter, the situation was medieval. ARVN soldiers and their American advisors lived in bunkers that flooded every afternoon during the monsoon rains. Resupply came by parachute drop, when it came at all, and roughly half the bundles drifted outside the perimeter into NVA-held ground. The smell was indescribable by late April. Unburied bodies in the tropical heat, ruptured sewage lines, the chemical tang of white phosphorus that clung to clothing and skin for days. Artillery fell on the city constantly, sometimes 200 rounds per day, and the defenders had no counter-battery capability worth mentioning. They held because they had nowhere to go and because the alternative was annihilation. But the tanks stopped coming in mass. And that was the difference. Before the TOW, An Loc's defenders had exactly one reliable method for stopping a T-54, the M-72LAW, a shoulder-fired rocket with an effective range of maybe 200 meters against a moving target. You had to let the tank get close enough to read the markings on the turret. Then you had to hit it somewhere the armor was thin enough to penetrate, which on a T-54 meant the engine deck or the rear hull. From the front, the LAW was essentially a noisemaker. ARVN soldiers had been doing this since April 12th, standing in foxholes while 36 tons of Soviet steel rolled toward them at close range, and some of them connected. I don't know how to describe from a desk what it takes to hold position while a tank closes to 200 meters. The TOW changed the calculus from 200 meters to 3,000. A soldier standing in a foxhole with a LAW became a gunner in a helicopter who could break contact in seconds. Near suicidal odds replaced by something almost clinical. The NVA had enough tanks to absorb infantry anti-tank fire and still breach a perimeter. They did not have enough tanks to absorb helicopter-launched precision missiles and still sustain an offensive. The logistics pipeline from the Soviet Union through China and down the Ho Chi Minh Trail could replace many things. Replacing T-54s took months. By late May, the armored thrusts had stopped entirely. NVA forces continued to shell the city and probe with infantry, but the massed tank columns that were supposed to deliver the killing blow never materialized again. On June 18th, ARVN forces, supported by massive American air power, broke the siege. The road to An Loc reopened on July 11th. 66 days, the city lost an estimated 10,000 civilian casualties. ARVN forces suffered over 5,000 killed and wounded. The NVA lost the better part of 3 divisions. At the Pentagon, a small group of Army aviation officers read the after-action reports from An Loc and understood exactly what had happened. 2 helicopters carrying an experimental weapon had disrupted an armored offensive involving an entire tank regiment. Whether a helicopter could kill a tank was settled. Now the question was, how many helicopters, carrying how many missiles, would be enough to stop the Soviets in the Fulda Gap? The program office at Redstone Arsenal had the after-action reports on their desks by August of 1972. Someone, the signature is illegible on the copy I found, had underlined a single sentence in red ink. The TOW system performed beyond design expectations in every measurable parameter. Their word, beyond. A weapon designed to kill Soviet tanks in Germany had just killed Soviet tanks in Vietnam, fired from a platform nobody at Hughes Aircraft had originally envisioned. At ranges, the skeptics said, couldn't be maintained from a vibrating helicopter airframe. The Army moved fast after that, which, if you know anything about Army procurement, is almost a contradiction in terms. The AH-1S Cobra received TOW integration by 1973. The program that would become the AH-64 Apache, purpose-built from the first blueprint as a TOW and Hellfire carrier, received its initial funding authorization in 1972. The same year, An Loc burned. Just as the T-54 crews on Route 13 had no framework for a missile arriving from 3,000 meters of open air, Soviet tank designers in Kharkov and Nizhny Tagil now had to redesign their armor doctrine around a threat that hadn't existed 18 months earlier. Reactive armor plates came first. Then the Stora infrared countermeasure system, then a complete redesign of turret geometry on the T-72 and T-80 series specifically to deflect shaped charge jets. All of it a direct response to what 2 Hueys did on a laterite road in Binh Long Province. By Desert Storm in 1991, American helicopters carrying TOW-2s destroyed more Iraqi armored vehicles in the first 48 hours than the entire NVA had lost at An Loc over 2 months. The missile had been upgraded 4 times by then. Longer range, tandem warheads to defeat reactive armor, improved guidance, better low-light acquisition. But the fundamental architecture was identical. Wire unspooling from a bobbin, infrared tracker on the tail. A gunner holding crosshairs steady while copper did the killing. The same principle, refined across 19 years of engineering iteration, built on data that came home from Vietnam in a classified pouch. So what became of the people? The TOW crews from the 1st Combat Aerial TOW team rotated home after their deployment. Most returned to conventional aviation assignments, a handful continued in weapons testing at Fort Huachuca and Aberdeen. The pilot, whose family requested anonymity, retired at the rank of colonel in the late 1980s. I can find no record of any crew member receiving the Medal of Honor for the An Loc engagements, which frankly irritates me given what they flew into, but multiple distinguished flying crosses were awarded. The ARVN lieutenant colonel, who weighed 95 pounds at the end of the siege, survived the war. He did not survive what came after. Records from the post-war re-education camps are fragmentary, but his name does not appear on any refugee lists. The NVA tank crews who died on Route 13 were buried where they fell, or not at all. Their families received standardized letters from Hanoi. On the evening of April 19, 1972, the surviving TOW crew at Bien Hoa ate cold sea rations on the flight line, wrote up their engagement logs, and prepped the aircraft for a dawn sortie.